Why won't you listen? A ghostly encounter. I've always had an affinity for finding treasures amid other people's cast-offs. As I sifted through boxes of old electronics at a neighborhood yard sale, my eye caught on something that made my heart skip. An antique-looking camera tucked away in the back corner, the kind with the accordion-style bellows and stylish retro design. Strange that something so eye-catching would be buried. As I turned the camera over in my hands, I felt an odd coolness seeping from the metal finish. And the hair on my arm stood on end when my skin made contact with the lens glass, like a gather of static electricity. Weird. But vintage cameras have always intrigued me, seeming to capture moments in time that persist long after their subjects faded into history. After forking over $20 to the elderly yard sale maven, I headed home eager to memorialize my decor finds in crisp black and white through the vintage lens. As I set up initial shots, I was frustrated by a persistent problem. Every photo emerging from the camera was inexplicably blank. Yet I knew the mechanism still advanced the film. Puzzled, I opened the back hatch, hoping the film wasn't too far degraded, as I knew an intact negative should still reveal an image. Shockingly, imprinted on the film itself was a message in scratchy but legible letters. Help! Find truth! My heart plummeted. This was no ordinary camera. Inside seemed to dwell the lost spirit of someone desperately clinging to solving the mystery of their early demise. What I'd stumbled upon could provide insight from beyond our earthly realm, or put my very life at risk. My hands shook, rattling the antique camera as I scrambled to make sense of the eerie message imprinted on the film. Finding truth? About what? A few explanations crept unbidden into my uneasy mind. Perhaps this camera had borne silent witness to some long-forgotten crime or tragedy, its supernatural resident doomed to haunt the grounds where they perished. Maybe whoever was trapped inside had valuable information, needing a living liaison to bring justice and peace. Although honestly, a less beneficent motive seemed equally possible. A vengeful spirit marooned between planes could also be manipulating innocent curiosity for menacing ends. Would unlocking the secrets of this entity put my mortal soul at risk? I slowly lowered the camera atop a bookshelf, needing distance to ponder my discovery. As I peered around my living room, the familiar setting now took on an ominous air. I became hyper-aware of encroaching shadows as the sun set, my cozy reading nook instead resembling the twisted backdrop of a horror movie set. Clearly getting to the root of the camera's hold on the departed soul required expert help. I'd heard rumors of a local university professor well-versed in translating messages, earthly or otherwise. Dr. Elias Northmore, an unconventional yet well-regarded parapsychology professor, seemed my best bet at making sense of such ghostly transmissions. I just prayed the venerable scholar's knowledge would prove key to safely solving the entity's cryptic demand. I fidgeted nervously the following morning outside the weathered wooden door, simply labelled Professor E. Northmore in cracked gold lettering. Despite having studied various theories of spectres and manifestations, I'd never thought myself likely to encounter genuine spirit activity. But things once confined to Gothic fables had taken an all-too-tangible turn. As Dr. Northmore invited me into his cramped, book-lined office, his eyes crinkled with concern at my unease. His tweed jacket and wispy white hair resembled a kind grandpa. But with a PhD in metaphysical interpretations, he was someone who just maybe could logically explain contacting those so definitively lost to us. Carefully, I laid the vintage camera between us on the desk, the distressed leather case protecting the otherworldly occupant within. Dr. Northmore gingerly examined the exterior before pausing pensively. Strong energy here. Old soul. Deep roots left untended, he murmured cryptically. I hesitantly recounted discovering the entity's plea for unveiling some obscured truth. With my fearful narrative complete, we lapsed into tense silence, punctuated only by the ticking antique clock. Photographic mediums are frequent spirit conduits, Dr. Northmore finally said. Emotion is powerfully imprinted on moment stills capture. He explained how violence or raw anguish could act as sinister beacons through the ethers. The wise professor agreed to attempt communicating with our restless guest, but only if I committed to serving benign aims. Feeling a renewed duty to the lost wanderer, I readily accepted despite the cold dread clutching my heart. Next weekend during the All Souls lunar transition should optimize reception between realms, Dr. Northmore stated, an unsettling certainty underlying his words. I shifted anxiously on the worn leather chair as various interpretations ran through my mind. The afternoon sun through Dr. Northmore's window revealed dust spinning lazily through the air, oddly magnifying the office's stillness. A trapped soul doesn't align to our comprehension of time's flow or memories fading, the professor finally murmured. Your camera's occupant could originate from any epoch. He explained that strong supernatural skills allowed rare, deceased to imprint themselves deliberately into objects via remaining psychic energy. But forcefully clinging to the physical plane prevented moving on, keeping them bound by an otherworldly web of torment. We must proceed cautiously to avoid complete destabilization. Northmore trailed off, before adding, of realities involved. He locked eyes with me then, as if confirming our shared course held unmentionable risks if mishandled. I realized no matter the spirit's weakened state between existence and afterlife, we still faced profound, vulnerable unknowns. Yet having heard their tortured outcry etched onto film, I felt resolute in fulfilling a charge to ease their suffering. Come the fated night of All Souls celebrations in a week's time, I would return, camera in hand, to hopefully grant rest to the wandering lost soul held within. As I turned to leave, gratitude mixed queasily with trepidation in my gut for what the sage professor and I would jointly come to discover from beyond the veil. Over the next few days at home, I couldn't shake the uneasy prickling at the edges of my awareness. A sensation of being watched from the shadows pervaded each room I entered. I'd occasionally catch movement flickering outside my vision, but spinning to confront it revealed only stillness. Restless nights followed where I lay rigid listening to the odd creaks and groans of the old house, until a thunderous crash shocked me upright. My antique typewriter lay mangled on the bedroom floor. I felt my heart stutter stepping carefully around the ruined machine. Hadn't it been secure atop a bookcase earlier? As I reached to examine the fractured typewriter, its ink ribbon suddenly began spinning wildly on its own. An unseen force aggressively jammed the keys as the paper holder ratcheted back and forth. Angry indented letters etched deeply onto the page spelled out, "Why won't you listen?" Icy realization prickled my spine. The entity trapped in my camera could traverse more than just photo paper, and it desperately craved my attention regarding mysteries only Dr. Northmore now held promise of unlocking. I knew we had a duty to urgently commune with our tormented guest. Picking up the camera with unsteady hands, I resolved to tell the professor preparation must accelerate before the cursed All Souls night arrived. For failing to rectify the spirit's unrest stirred up forces we mortals were never meant to reckon with. Repairing the shattered typewriter provided distraction from uneasy thoughts plaguing me following the spectral outburst. I felt grateful the camera's restless occupant only damaged objects. If the same chaotic energy had struck my physical form, I shuddered to imagine the consequences. As I cleaned the mangled keys and spilled ink, it dawned on me that the machine mimicked the entity's own state. Locked in others' perception of roles and time, yet fractured upon anxious, closer examination. Its paper wheels for channeling communication had forcibly revolted as the steam-powered engine clacked reasoning without true empathy. Both contraptions ultimately sought external understanding from their mechanics. This solemn musing stirred an awakened urgency in me, to prevent the lost messenger from corroding further into fragments unrecognizable from the soul they once embodied. For not engaging the plea for revelation extracted a far greater toll than mere objects now symbolized. I knew Dr. Northmore needed preparation to move our frightened visitor toward restful eternity, before restless energy grew strong enough to breach the veil irreparably. In this race to remedy the unraveling unseen, I prayed the professor's experience provided vision that my overwhelmed psyche lacked. For the broken typewriter seemed an omen of humanity itself disintegrating when empathy for the suffering fell lacking. I arrived at Dr. Northmore's office flushed and out of breath, fresh anxiety quickening my steps. Wordlessly, I presented the disturbing message engraved onto paper by the violent spectral force. The professor's eyes narrowed gravely as his fingers traced the aggressive indentations. A dire sign indeed. The spirit's stability fractures without channels for coherent expression, he murmured. We must hasten to establish contact. Dr. Northmore described a ritual calling directly to earthbound entities. By recombining specially inscribed word symbols, a temporary rift opens, allowing two-way conversation between the living and the lingering. The window-viewing ritual can bridge understanding, Northmore continued. But we may access deeper knowledge or darker threat. He emphasized that engaging an agitated ghost bore risks if its full motives went unconfirmed. Yet my conscience weighed heavy. We owed sincerity to this stranded being crying out so desperately to be heard. I brought the vintage camera into Northmore's dimly lit sitting room the next evening. Candles surrounded a low table, displaying a strange arrangement of rocks etched with unfamiliar glyphs. As Northmore lit the last wick, the very air pressure dropped substantially, signalling preparations were set to let an arcane veil lift between worlds present and past. The professor nodded solemnly toward me, then began the spine-chilling incantation. As the professor uttered the mystical syllables, the candles flared violently, then dimmed to a mere flicker. A gasped sob echoed from unseen hollows, followed by a face materializing before us, the terrified eyes of a young woman. Her ethereal form wavered in the candlelight as she glanced wildly about the room. "Help! Why has no one found me?" her reedy voice pleaded, edged with panic. My heart dropped, realizing we had opened a channel not to those departed, but rather to the urgently alive. "What is the last you remember, my dear?" Dr. Northmore gently asked. Haltingly, she described being grabbed and drugged after leaving a bar 2 months prior. Flashes of a crude basement room and her tormentor's grinning face haunted her memory. Though escape attempts proved futile once her kidnapper revealed his threats against her family should she resist. I shared an uneasy glance with the professor. This lost soul was still present in mortal flesh, though her psyche had instinctively projected to the arcane planes, searching for any lifeline. Dr. Northmore slowly explained what we gleaned of her terrible imprisonment, and that returning fully to her earthly form remained key to revealing the dark location housing her bodily cage. The young woman nodded resolutely before fading back into darkness. Now we raced not only to uncover vile obscurities, but more urgently to save an innocent life clinging desperately to existence. As the last candle flickered out, the weight of our task pressed heavily on my shoulders. I ached for the terrified woman now returned to merciless captivity. Dr. Northmore and I pieced together the paltry clues. A rough basement location near the bar she left that fateful night, descriptions of her abductor too generic to trace. Calling the authorities felt imperative, though the professor warned what would greet such incredible claims. Sure enough, 2 stiff officers arrived to eye us incredulously as we showed the ritual space and recounted the ghostly encounter. "You really expect us to investigate a kidnapping because a ghost told you so? Who's to say this isn't some prank?" the older cop scolded. As they turned to leave, I desperately mentioned the Lucky Fox Bar, pleading for them to at least inquire there. With a skeptical huff, the officers agreed to ask if any patrons went missing that night 2 months prior. I felt helpless watching their cars depart, hoping fervently they took some small initiative. I turned to Dr. Northmore, desperation surely etched on my face. If the police won't act, we must reopen communication. The woman's soul projected to us for a reason. Because mortal measures failed her, I urged. Though clearly fatigued from the intense ritual, Northmore gave one slow nod. Life and death hung precariously in the balance. As we prepared feverishly for the dangerous spirit channeling, my heart fractured imagining the captive woman's terror. Would she even still cling to life once we forged a gateway to her psyche's refuge? Had evil already doused her fragile courage? We worked urgently through the night, flouting the laws of reality itself to hopefully save just one. As the first rays of dawn crept into the musty ritual room, I startled awake, not realizing I'd drifted off. The candles had long since extinguished themselves, wisps of smoke lingering like forgotten dreams. Dr. Northmore sat with eyes closed in concentrated meditation while holding my vintage camera, the original conduit that led us to this desperate crossroads. I hesitated to disturb the professor's trance, yet anxiety bred unrest. Had he already attempted to reopen the channel to our imperiled captive without my conscious presence? As if sensing my spiraling thoughts, Northmore's eyes blinked open. I communed on spiritual wavelengths to gather any traces left of her essence, he said wearily. Through deep connection, Northmore discerned the woman still clung fiercely but falteringly to life. Though her strength was spent battling demons both within her prison and inside her mind. She had withdrawn as a bulwark against total collapse, perhaps affordably patient, or already admitting defeat. I pleaded with Northmore that we journey into transdimensional contact once more that night when psychic currents ran strongest. He agreed somberly, cautioning that sending my consciousness rather than just speech itself allowed more empathy, yet exposed my psyche to obscure risks. But how could I refuse the summons for salvation by one already so despairingly imperiled? We both understood too shatteringly well. Refusing to plunge my own hands into darkness would surely surrender the last of her light forever. Shadows danced across the ritual walls as we prepared for midnight communion once more. The camera lens glinted, almost knowingly, containing our only link to the kidnapped soul we hoped to wrench from oblivion's maw. As Northmore's incantations whispered to a close, I trained every fibre of my being into the psychic channels opening unseen portals around us. Suddenly, the spectral form of the captive woman shuddered into being, her face etched with even deeper desperation and fatigue. She haltingly described overhearing her captor mention a basement location on Oakwood Lane, near an old wire factory. Visions of duct-taped wrists chained to a pipe flashed through her memory, and a repetitive metallic clanging echoed from upstairs. Perhaps the old floorboards protested under the pacing steps of her tormentor. "Please hurry!" she cried out as her projection flickered and faded, precious time and energy already so depleted. My heart caught in my throat, realizing we likely just witnessed this woman's final ghostly outreach. It was now up to Northmore, and I alone, to decipher these clues leading to her underground cell before evil stamped out her real-world light forever. With bated breath, we pored over maps provided by the skeptical police officers, scrutinizing the details gathered. Just as pale dawn glowed promisingly on the horizon, I spotted it. An abandoned wire factory a few blocks from the Lucky Fox bar on the preternaturally named Oakwood Lane. Our shoes clattered urgently down the old building steps toward whatever climax lay in store on this ordinary street hiding nefarious secrets. I gripped the squad car door handle as our convoy raced toward hidden depravity. The statistic police radio confirmed it. Another young woman vanished last night just 2 blocks from where our spirit captive's body lay confined. Time was no longer measured in minutes, but in ticking heartbeats drawing innocence closer to the Reaper's blade. As we screeched up to the decrepit factory, my breath halted at the sight of a nondescript white van parked by a padlocked cellar door. In my mind's eye, I glimpsed the faceless shadow dragging fresh prey down rotting wooden stairs to a makeshift tomb below. The SWAT team tore into the building searching for the entrance to perdition, while CSI specialists checked for traces of those passed through indifferent fates. An anguished cry rang out minutes later. Officers had discovered Hell's anteroom concealed by a false wall. Working feverishly with the tools of their trade, they cut the lock as Dr. Northmore and I clung to one another, scarcely daring to breathe. A visceral gasp. Then uniformed men carried out the limp, wheezing form of the woman we had desperately sought across ethereal realms. "She's still with us, but barely," the EMT called out as they raced her to the ambulance outside. My relief shattered just as quickly, however. For the investigators' next victims revealed macabre actions no ritual could undo. Though perhaps in the beyond, their souls rested cradled in the arms of better men than inhabited this wicked earth. As the van doors clanged shut, on Providence narrowly regained, I uttered a silent prayer against the evil that walked so freely unchecked beside us all. In the months following the dramatic rescue and capture, my sleep remained plagued by spectral visions, the echoes of girls who never made it out of that profane cellar alive. I began catching faint glimpses of their muted forms in mirrors and shop windows when passing by. At times I could swear I heard their mournful whispers riding on the night breeze. My sensitivity toward those dwelling between planes seemed permanently amplified after opening untested psychic channels. Professor Northmore theorized that preserving the life essence of one hovering precariously between states created a lasting imprint on my mortal energies. One wispy form in particular frequented my dreams. The first spirit who had desperately reached out across the void for salvation. Though we had succeeded in sparing her human shell from the Reaper's scythe, she yet seemed to linger at the edges of my perception. Soon sleep felt impossible, with the pressing ghostly crowds invading unbidden. I wondered, had ushering one departing soul back from death's curtain torn irrevocable holes between dimensions we were never meant to tamper with? As I confessed these perpetual visitations to Dr. Northmore, I was surprised to find compassion rather than unease etched on the professor's aged face. "My dear, though we failed to redeem some from their fate, perhaps you can now channel your rare gift into seeking justice for spirits beyond mortal reach," he intoned gently. At his words, revelation dawned within me. My curse was being shaped into sacred charge. By communing between spheres, I would give voice from the void to undo more earthly atrocities otherwise sheltered behind the veil.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like, comment, and share. Come back often for more ghostly, paranormal tales. Some are based on real sightings and some are just short stories. Either way, I hope you enjoy. Don't have nightmares.